Story number 1. The Whispering Walls. It started when the Daniels family moved into the old house on Maple Street. The house was large, empty, and had been on the market for years. Most people in town avoided it, whispering rumors about its past, but to the Daniels it seemed like a dream, a fresh start, a place to put down roots. There was something eerie about the house, the way the wind would howl through the cracks in the walls, the creaking of the floorboards at night, the shadows that never quite seemed to leave the corners of the rooms. But what bothered them most were the whispers. It was subtle at first, just a low murmur, like the sound of wind or maybe distant voices from the street. But soon, the whispers began to grow, always just beyond hearing. Claire Daniels, the mother, would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to tell whether the sounds were real or in her head. She tried to ignore it. Everyone in town said the house had been empty for decades, and yet, here she was, hearing things no one else seemed to notice. But one night, after the family had been there for about a month, Claire sat at the kitchen table, looking at the chipped walls when it started again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. The whispers seemed to come from within the walls themselves, like something was pressing against them, trying to push through. "Help us," the voice said, a voice that was too old to belong to anyone she knew. The next night, the whispers came again, but this time they spoke her name. "Claire! Claire!" She froze. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Then there was another voice, one that was deeper, colder. "Don't listen to them, Claire," it said. "They're not who they say they are." Shivers ran down her spine. She tried to ignore it, but the whispers kept coming, louder, clearer. At first, it was just the walls of the house, seemingly alive with the voices of those who once lived there, of those who had died and were never properly laid to rest. But soon, it spread beyond the house, into the town itself. People began talking about the whispers, about hearing things in the night. Terrible things. Things they couldn't unhear. The town's history was steeped in tragedy. Old murders, dark secrets buried under years of silence. But now, the spirits were waking up. They were angry. And they had memories that stretched back generations. Memories they wanted to share with the living, whether the living wanted to hear it or not. One by one, the townspeople began losing their minds. They'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming, their eyes wide with terror. They spoke of things they couldn't know, secrets, lies, things that only the dead should remember. At first, Claire thought it was just a coincidence, but then her daughter, Lily, started hearing the whispers too. She'd sit in the corner of her room, staring at the walls, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. "They want us to leave, Mom," Lily said one evening, her voice trembling. "They said they won't let us go." It was then Claire realized the truth. The spirits weren't just whispering, they were hunting them. They tried to leave. The Daniels packed up their belongings and Claire drove her family through the town, hoping to escape. But as they neared the edge of Maple Street, the car stopped. The engine wouldn't start, no matter how hard she turned the key. The town felt wrong, still heavy, like it was holding them captive. And that's when the whispers began again. "Don't leave," they said. "You can't leave." Claire looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind them. But it was just the dark, stretching back toward the house. "Mom," Lily whispered, "what's happening?" Claire's heart pounded as the temperature in the car seemed to drop and the windows fogged up. In the distance, she saw shadows moving behind the houses, ghostly figures, walking slowly toward them. "They're coming for us," she said, her voice shaking. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. and Claire could no longer tell where they were coming from. The voices mixed together, old and new, calling out to her, pulling her back toward the house. "Claire, don't run," they urged. "We need you." The car door flew open by itself, and before Claire could stop her, Lily stepped out. Claire screamed, reaching out to grab her, but Lily was already walking toward the house, drawn by the voices. "You can't leave," Lily said, her voice distant, her face blank. "They want me to stay." Desperately, Claire chased after her, but the closer she got to the house, the harder it became to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with the anger of the spirits trapped within. She could feel their eyes on her, cold, empty, but filled with centuries of sorrow. By the time Claire reached Lily, it was too late. The whispers surrounded them, wrapping around their minds like a noose. The spirits didn't want them to leave. They needed them, needed their voices, their souls. The Daniels family had become part of the house, part of the town, trapped forever in the whispering walls. And as the night grew darker, the whispers grew louder, calling to anyone who would listen, promising terrible things they could never unhear. The town of Maple Street was no longer just haunted by the past. It had become a prison, one where the walls themselves whispered the dark secrets of the dead, and no one who listened could ever escape. Story number 2: Echoes in the Attic. When Emily and Jack moved into the old house on Birchwood Lane, they were excited about the idea of starting fresh. The house was exactly what they had been looking for: charming, spacious, and tucked away in a quiet New England town. It had a history, though, a long one. Over 2 centuries had passed since it was first built, and the house had seen its share of families come and go. It was a piece of history in a world that was rapidly changing. It didn't take long for them to notice the odd things happening around the house. The creaks and groans of the old floorboards, the strange cold drafts that seemed to move through the rooms, and the feeling of being watched. Those were the easy things to ignore. But what they couldn't ignore were the sounds coming from the attic. It started innocently enough. A muffled noise in the middle of the night, like soft laughter, almost like children playing. Emily thought it was just the house settling, the wind, or maybe even her imagination. But the next night it happened again, and again, and again. Jack, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. "Probably just some animals up there, mice or something," he said one evening. But even he couldn't explain the dragging sound that followed the laughter. A slow, heavy dragging of feet across the wooden floor above them. One evening, when the noises grew louder and more distinct, Emily could no longer ignore them. Her curiosity got the best of her. She stood by the attic door listening. The laughter was clearer now, almost joyful, mixed with the unmistakable sound of feet dragging slowly across the floor. It was coming from up there, from somewhere above them. The attic. Emily turned to Jack, who was sitting on the couch, absorbed in a book. "I'm going up there," she said, her voice trembling. Jack glanced up, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure?" "It's probably nothing." But Emily was already making her way to the stairs. The attic had always felt a little off to her. There was something about it, something strange about the way the air felt thick, like it was holding secrets. She grabbed the old iron handle of the attic door and opened it. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she made her way up, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust motes floated in the air, and the smell of age and mildew hit her as she stepped inside. The laughter stopped. The dragging sound stopped. There was a sudden, eerie silence. Emily shivered and stepped further into the attic. Boxes and old furniture were piled high, covered in sheets and dust. She began to move through the clutter, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space, when something caught her eye. On a dusty old shelf in the corner of the room, an old, leather-bound book sat alone. It looked out of place among the forgotten trinkets and cobwebs. She reached for it, brushing off the thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, almost fragile, and when she opened it, the pages crackled in her hands. It was a diary, and as she flipped through the pages, she realized it wasn't just any diary. It belonged to a girl who had lived in the house over 100 years ago. The entries were filled with childish handwriting, simple and neat at first, but as the pages turned, they became more frantic. The girl wrote about her family, her father, her mother, and her older brother. She spoke of strange feelings in the house, of voices she heard at night, of things that moved in the shadows. Then, in the final pages, the tone shifted entirely. The girl wrote about how she was being punished by her family, about how they were angry with her for something she couldn't understand. And then, in one chilling line, she wrote, "They want to make me disappear. They will make me disappear." Emily's hand shook as she turned the last page. The ink was smudged, as if the girl had written it in a hurry. The final entry was a cryptic, tear-stained mess of words. "They killed me, but I won't leave. I'll never leave." Her heart raced as she stood in the dim attic, the old diary clutched in her hands. The laughter returned, only now it sounded different, darker. It wasn't the innocent sound of children playing anymore. It was taunting. And the dragging noise started again, but this time it was closer. Much closer. Emily spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears. In the corner of the room, a shadow flickered, shifting unnaturally. She backed away slowly, but the shadow followed her. It wasn't just a shadow. It was her. The girl, the one from the diary. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure grew clearer, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared directly at her. "You found me," the figure whispered in a voice that sounded like the wind. "Now you can't leave either." Emily turned and bolted for the stairs, her feet stumbling over the rickety steps. She could hear the dragging feet behind her, getting closer with every second. As she reached the bottom, she slammed the attic door shut and locked it. But the whispering didn't stop. The laughter didn't stop. It filled the house, piercing, relentless. Jack was waiting for her in the living room when she stumbled down the stairs, breathless, eyes wide with terror. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "What happened? What's going on?" But Emily couldn't speak. Her mind was racing. The girl's words echoed in her head, growing louder with every passing moment. "I won't leave. I'll never leave." Days passed, but the spirit wouldn't leave her. It followed Emily everywhere, at work, at the store, even when she tried to sleep. The laughter was in her ears, the dragging sound at her heels. The house had taken hold of her, just like it had taken hold of the girl before her. The obsession grew. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the diary, about the girl's tragic end. She spent hours poring over the pages, convinced that the girl's spirit needed her help, that she was the only one who could set her free. But the more Emily read, the more she began to understand. The girl hadn't been murdered by her family. She had been driven to madness, to despair, by something far more dangerous, the house itself. And the house wanted Emily now. It wasn't just the spirit of the girl anymore, it was the house, alive, feeding off her fear, her obsession. It wanted her to join the others, to become a part of the history that lingered in the walls. One night, Emily woke to find herself standing at the top of the attic stairs, the door open before her. The house whispered her name. And in that moment she realized it was too late. She had already become part of the house's twisted story. The girl's spirit had never left. And now, neither would Emily. The last sound Emily heard, as the door to the attic closed behind her, was the sound of dragging feet, growing louder, closer. And then, nothing. Story number 3. The Hollow Man. For as long as anyone could remember, the children in the small town of Briarwood had been told the same story, a warning passed down through generations. It was always the same. Stay out of the woods after dark, stay away from the Hollow Man. They didn't need to know exactly who or what the Hollow Man was, but they knew one thing for certain: you didn't mess with him. The story was always whispered around campfires and told in hushed voices before bed. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes. No one could say exactly where he came from, but everyone knew his name. The Hollow Man roamed the woods at night, and those foolish enough to wander into the forest would never come back. Some said he was a man who had lost his soul. Others claimed he was the spirit of an old woodsman who had died long ago. Whatever he was, the warnings were clear. Stay out of the woods, and you would be fine. But warnings, as warnings often do, began to lose their power as the kids grew older. They laughed at the stories. They rolled their eyes when the old people in town spoke in hushed tones about the Hollow Man. They didn't believe in things like ghosts or curses or any of that nonsense. So when 4 friends, Ethan, Lily, Jake, and Sam, decided to take a midnight stroll into the woods, it was with the cocky confidence of teenagers who thought they were invincible. "I bet we don't even see anything," Jake said, grinning as he pushed his way through the thick underbrush. The others followed behind him, laughing, the chill night air crisp against their skin. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest. But there was something else. A feeling. It wasn't the normal quiet of the woods. It was off, like the trees themselves were watching them. "I don't like this," Lily said, her voice tense as she looked around. She stopped in her tracks, sensing something in the air, but the others just laughed it off. "Come on, it's all just stories," Sam said, nudging her forward. They continued deeper into the forest, their footsteps crunching in the leaves. It wasn't long before they came upon something unexpected, something they hadn't been prepared for. A graveyard. It was hidden, tucked between the trees like a secret that had been buried for years. A forgotten place. Gravestones stood crooked and weathered, moss growing over the old stone markers. The air felt colder here, and the sense of something being wrong was almost suffocating. "This doesn't feel right," Lily whispered, but Ethan was already moving closer, curious. He was the first to kneel beside one of the gravestones, brushing the dirt away with his hands. The name on the marker was barely visible, faded by time, but there was something about it that caught his eye. "You have to see this," he called out to the others, his voice filled with excitement. The others joined him, leaning in closer. The name was impossible to read, but something about it felt wrong. The inscription seemed to shift, as though it didn't want to be seen. The earth around the grave felt soft, almost alive, as if something underneath was moving. "Let's get out of here," Lily said, her voice shaking now. "I don't like this." But it was too late. As they turned to leave, the ground beneath them seemed to groan, like the earth itself was waking up. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature dropped. The darkness around them grew heavier, pressing in from all sides. And then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind them. They turned around, and there he was. The Hollow Man. He stood at the edge of the graveyard, tall and thin, his figure impossibly gaunt. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. The air around him was thick with a sense of dread, as if the very presence of the Hollow Man pulled the life out of everything it touched. "Run," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. But it was too late. The Hollow Man was already moving toward them, his long, crooked legs dragging across the ground. His movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. They ran. The woods were a blur as they tore through the trees, their breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast they ran, the sound of those dragging footsteps followed them, getting closer and closer with every step. They didn't stop until they burst out of the woods and into the town, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the Hollow Man was still with them. They could feel him watching from the darkness. His presence lingered like a shadow, always just behind them. That night, they thought they were safe. They locked their doors and pulled the curtains closed, trying to drown out the terror they felt in the pit of their stomachs. But the Hollow Man didn't need to be near them to make his presence known. As the night wore on, strange things started happening. Ethan was the first to hear it. A slow, dragging sound in the hallway outside his room. He opened the door, but there was nothing there. Lily woke to the feeling of cold fingers brushing against her face, but when she opened her eyes, the room was empty. The others heard it too, the whispers, the dragging footsteps, the sound of something, or someone, moving just beyond their reach. They realized, too late, that the Hollow Man had followed them home. And his reach was far more terrifying than they ever could have imagined. It wasn't just the woods that were haunted now, it was the town. The Hollow Man had come with them, and he wasn't leaving. As the days passed, the town seemed to grow darker. People began to disappear, one by one, as if something was taking them, pulling them into the shadows. And everywhere, the sound of dragging footsteps echoed in the streets, in the alleyways, in the places no one dared to go. The Hollow Man had come for them all. Ethan, Lily, Jake, and Sam never saw another day after that. They became part of the town's history. The ones who had dared to wander too far into the woods, the ones who had disturbed the forgotten graveyard. And now, they were just whispers in the night, voices that joined the others, always listening for the sound of dragging feet, always waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And the Hollow Man? He still roams the woods, waiting for the next group of foolish children to cross his path. Story number 4. The Forgotten Dead. In the town of Ashford, things weren't what they used to be. The town had seen better days, much better days. The streets that were once lively with children's laughter now stood empty. The shops on Main Street had long been boarded up, the paint peeling from the buildings, their windows cracked and dirty. Ashford wasn't a place anyone wanted to visit anymore. But there was one part of town that still drew attention, or rather, gave off an eerie pull. On the outskirts beyond the edge of town sat an old cemetery. It was the kind of cemetery you didn't talk about, the kind of place that was better left forgotten. It was said to be the final resting place of Ashford's founders, the men and women who had built the town from the ground up. But over the years, the cemetery had fallen into ruin. The gravestones were weathered, their names almost illegible, and weeds grew wild between the cracks in the paths. The iron fence that once stood tall around it was now rusted, sagging under the weight of time. The townsfolk had always avoided the place, treating it as though it were cursed. The stories about the cemetery, whispers of strange happenings, of lights flickering late at night, of a shadowy figure wandering between the graves, had kept most people away. But those were just stories, right? Or so they thought. It all started when the first disappearance happened. Maggie Harper, a young woman who had lived in Ashford all her life, was last seen walking home from the grocery store one evening. Her house wasn't far from the edge of town, and as she passed the cemetery, she waved at her neighbor, old Mr. Doyle, who was sitting on his porch. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her family searched the town, the woods surrounding it, and even the cemetery itself, but Maggie was never found. The police wrote it off as a case of someone leaving, maybe running away to start fresh. But the town wasn't so sure. Things like that didn't happen in Ashford. People didn't just vanish. Then came the strange deaths. Old Mrs. Wells, the town's librarian, had always been a bit of an eccentric. She lived alone in a small house near the cemetery, and for as long as anyone could remember, she'd been a quiet, harmless woman. But one morning, her house caught fire, though no one could explain how. The flames spread quickly, engulfing her home, and when the firemen arrived, they found her body, charred beyond recognition. The doctors couldn't explain it. It didn't look like she had been trapped in the fire. It was as if the fire had started in her, consumed her from the inside out. By now, the whispers around town had grown louder. Some said the cemetery was cursed, that the spirits of the forgotten founders were angry, restless, that they were demanding something, anything, to be remembered. But no one knew for sure. The town's history was old, and much of it had been lost to time. Whatever had happened in Ashford's past, it seemed the town's founders didn't want to be forgotten. Then came the visions. It was on a hot, sticky summer night when it happened to Peter Evans, the town's only remaining police officer. He was sitting in his office, staring at the walls, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The town was silent, as it always was these days. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He turned quickly, expecting to see something. Maybe a stray cat or the shadow of a car passing by. But there was nothing there. That's when he heard it. The sound of whispering. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing against his ear, but then it grew louder, more distinct. He couldn't make out the words, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere, all at once. He stood up, his heart racing. The whispers grew into a chant, a low, menacing murmur that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He turned to look out the window, and that's when he saw them. The figures. They were standing at the edge of the cemetery, their outlines barely visible in the moonlight. But Peter could see them clearly. Tall, gaunt, their faces pale and expressionless. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring back at him. He couldn't tear his eyes away. His heart pounded in his chest as the figures slowly raised their arms, reaching toward him, beckoning him to come closer. But Peter didn't move. He couldn't. His feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures were gone. The whispering stopped. Peter ran to the cemetery the next day, determined to find out what was happening. He had to know. As he walked between the graves, his footsteps echoing in the silence, he felt the weight of the town's history pressing down on him. The gravestones were worn, the names almost unreadable. But there was something about the place that felt wrong, like it was alive, watching him. And that's when he found it. A single grave, hidden behind a cluster of overgrown weeds, with a stone marker barely standing upright. Peter knelt down to get a closer look, and as his fingers brushed the weathered stone, he felt a cold, sharp chill run through him. The name on the marker was faded, but he could still make it out. Samuel McGregor, founder of Ashford. Peter didn't know much about Samuel McGregor, but he knew enough to understand that the man had been one of the original settlers. But there was something odd about the grave. The soil around it was freshly disturbed, as though someone had recently dug it up. He stood up, his mind racing. That's when he heard the whispers again. Low at first, but growing louder, the words clearer this time. "Remember us." Peter felt a surge of panic in his chest. The town's founders weren't at rest. They weren't forgotten. They had been waiting for someone to remember them. As he turned to leave, the ground beneath his feet trembled. The whispers became a roar. The spirits of Ashford's past were rising, angry and desperate. They would not be ignored any longer, and they were coming for him. Peter ran, but the whispers followed, echoing in his ears, filling his head. As he reached the edge of the cemetery, he looked back just once and saw them, countless shadowy figures, emerging from the graves reaching for him. They were coming, and there was nowhere to hide. The forgotten dead were awake, and Ashford would never be the same again. In the days that followed, the town was abandoned. No one dared stay after the terrible things they witnessed. The cemetery had claimed them all, and the forgotten dead had finally been remembered, by any means necessary. Story number 5. The Cold Shadows. Emma had always been a woman of quiet strength, the kind of person who didn't let things get to her. But when Alex died, everything changed. The world she had known, her plans, her dreams, crumbled. The man she had promised forever to was gone, taken from her in a flash, and with him went a part of her. It was hard to breathe in the silence that followed. The house they'd shared, their little apartment filled with pictures of trips and moments they'd planned together, had become suffocating. Every corner felt like a reminder, every room echoing with the ghost of his absence. So, Emma made a decision. She left everything behind: the apartment, the city, the memories. She found a cabin, a small, secluded thing up in the mountains, far from the noise, far from everything. It was an old structure built with wood that smelled of pine and dampness. The view from the window was breathtaking. The mountains stretched out like silent giants, their peaks disappearing into the clouds. It was the perfect place to grieve, to get away from everything, and maybe, just maybe, begin to heal. The first few nights were peaceful. The wind would howl outside, rattling the windows, but inside it was warm and still. Emma spent her days in solitude, walking the quiet trails and finding solace in the emptiness of the wilderness. But as the days passed, something began to shift. It started with the cold. At first, it was just a small thing. A chill in the air that she couldn't explain. A breeze that whispered through the cracks in the cabin's old wooden walls. But it grew. Slowly. At night, the cold became unbearable. No matter how many blankets she piled on her bed, no matter how tightly she closed the windows, it was there. An icy presence that settled over her like a heavy fog. Emma thought it was just the weather. The mountains were known for their bitter winters after all. But this was different. This cold wasn't natural. It wasn't the kind of cold that simply came with the season. It felt alive, heavy and pressing, as though it was waiting for something or someone. It wasn't long before the shadows started to change. At first, they were small, just the flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a shape that would disappear as soon as she turned her head. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more persistent the shadows became. One night, she woke up to the sound of soft scraping against the floorboards. Her heart raced as she lay there, staring into the darkness. The cold was unbearable now, seeping through the cabin's walls, sinking into her bones. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, but the cold kept creeping in. And then she saw them. In the corner of the room where the shadows gathered, there were figures. Dark, twisted shapes that seemed to shift and move just beyond the reach of the dim light from the single bulb overhead. Their forms were indistinct, like smoke, but there was no mistaking the feeling they gave her: cold, empty, hungry. She gasped, sitting up in bed, her pulse racing. The shadows didn't move, but she could feel their eyes on her, pressing into her like the weight of the night itself. She wanted to scream, but no sound came from her throat. The figures didn't speak, they didn't need to. Their presence was enough. They were watching her, waiting. The next day, Emma decided she would leave. She packed a small bag and started down the mountain trail. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt it, the cold. It wrapped around her like a cold hand on her chest, choking her, pulling her back toward the cabin. The mountain seemed to close in on her, the path narrowing, the trees crowding in like a prison. No matter how far she walked, the cold never left. It followed her, relentless and heavy, pressing against her skin. By the time she returned to the cabin, exhausted and trembling, she realized that leaving wasn't an option. The spirits were not going to let her go. That night, the shadows were closer. They were at the foot of her bed, their dark shapes looming over her, their cold breath brushing against her skin. She could feel their presence, cold and ancient, like something that had been waiting for centuries. And then, as if they had heard her thoughts, one of them stepped forward. A tall figure, its face hidden in darkness, its eyes glowing with a faint, icy light. It didn't speak, but Emma could hear its voice in her mind. "Join us," it whispered. "You belong with us now. We've been waiting for you." The words chilled her to the bone. She tried to move, to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. The shadows closed in, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, sending a wave of frozen terror through her. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, the cold becoming unbearable. "Join us," the voice whispered again, and this time Emma felt herself drifting, as if the shadows were pulling her in, making her one with the cold that had settled in the mountain. In the days that followed, Emma began to change. She stopped trying to leave. The cold was a part of her now, settling deep in her chest, in her bones. The shadows no longer lurked in the corners of the cabin. They were with her now, always, following her every movement, whispering to her in the silence. Emma never left the cabin again. The spirits of the mountain had claimed her, and she had joined them in their eternal, frozen wait. And somewhere, far below, in the town she once called home, they would whisper her name, asking if anyone remembered the woman who had come to the mountain seeking peace. But Emma didn't care anymore. She was with them now, the forgotten, the lost, the cold shadows of the mountain, and they would never let her go. Story number 6. The Seer of Nightfall. In the small coastal town of Nightfall, there was one name that sent shivers down the spines of the locals: Marjorie Caldwell. Marjorie wasn't like the other townsfolk. She was blind, a woman who had never seen the beauty of the sea or the faces of her neighbors. But despite her blindness, she was known as something else, a name that carried an air of mystery and dread. She was the Seer of Nightfall. Marjorie lived in a small cottage at the edge of town, near the cliffs that overlooked the crashing waves below. People said she could see things that others couldn't, things that were hidden in the world of the dead. Spirits, they called them. Marjorie could speak to them, listen to their whispers, and warn the living of things that were to come. The townsfolk had learned to respect her over the years. When she said there was a storm on the way, it would hit. When she warned of illness, it would spread. When she spoke of tragedy, it came true. No one knew how she did it. She couldn't see, after all. But Marjorie's predictions had a way of coming true. But one evening, as the sun set and the sky turned deep purple, Marjorie stood on her front porch, her hand outstretched toward the horizon, sensing something that none of them could see. Her voice, usually calm and steady, trembled as she spoke. "There's something coming," she said, her words soft but filled with an undeniable urgency. "A spirit, a vengeful one. It's returning. It will bring death, and it will not stop until it has claimed what it wants." The locals listened to her warnings, but as time passed, they grew weary of the old woman's prophecies. They'd heard her speak of storms, of fires, of things that never came to pass. They had learned to dismiss her, chalking it up to her eccentricities, the ramblings of a blind woman who was growing old. But Marjorie wasn't wrong. It started slowly at first. Strange things began to happen around nightfall. The air felt heavier, colder. Shadows seemed to stretch longer in the evenings. Some said they saw figures moving along the cliffs at night, figures that vanished when you looked away. Others reported hearing whispering voices on the wind, voices that didn't belong to anyone alive. It wasn't long before people started disappearing. The first to vanish was Tom Richards, a fisherman who had lived in Nightfall his whole life. He was out on his boat as usual when the storm hit. He never came back. The waves claimed him, or so they thought. But Marjorie knew better. "The spirit has taken him," she whispered when they came to her for guidance. "It's hungry, and it's just beginning." The townsfolk were uneasy now, but they didn't know what to do. What could they do? No one believed in the dead walking the earth, in spirits that could reach across the veil to claim the living. Marjorie's warnings went ignored until it was too late. More people vanished. A child, a woman, a father. The fear gripped the town like a sickness, spreading fast. The townsfolk barricaded themselves in their homes at night, hoping the spirit would spare them. But as the days passed, it became clear that no one was safe. The spirit grew bolder. The attacks were no longer confined to the darkness. The town was being torn apart, and no one knew how to stop it. That's when a group of people, those few who still trusted Marjorie, came together. They were desperate, willing to do anything to save their town. They didn't know what to expect, but they were willing to face whatever came. Among them was Sarah, a young woman whose son had been taken, and Ben, a local blacksmith who had seen the spirit with his own eyes. They went to Marjorie's cottage, hoping for guidance, for some kind of answer that would lead them to salvation. Marjorie sat in the dimly lit room, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but calm. She had been waiting for them. "You've come for the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos that had overtaken the town. "The spirit that is hunting you is one of vengeance. It has been trapped in the earth for centuries, buried beneath the cliffs. But it has been released, and now it is hungry." Marjorie's fingers twitched, and her head tilted slightly, as though listening to something just beyond the reach of the living. "It was once a man," she continued, her voice growing softer. "A man who sought to destroy the town. He was betrayed, cast aside, and now he seeks to make them all pay. The town must give him what he wants, or he will take it, piece by piece." They asked her how to stop it, how to end the spirit's reign of terror. Marjorie fell silent for a long moment, her face strained as she searched the air around her, her senses reaching out toward the spirit that hung over the town. Finally, she spoke. "The spirit can only be stopped by facing it, by confronting the past and giving it what it is owed. There is a relic, a symbol of the betrayal that released it. It must be destroyed. Only then will the spirit be laid to rest." The group left her cottage with a newfound sense of purpose, though they still didn't fully understand what Marjorie meant. They ventured toward the cliffs, toward the place where the spirit had been buried, to search for the relic that would stop the nightmare. As they neared the cliffside, they saw it. A grave marker, hidden in the overgrown grass. The name on it was barely legible, but the air around it felt cold and heavy, as though the spirit itself was watching them. They dug into the earth, their hearts pounding in their chests, until they unearthed a small, rusted box. Inside, they found an old amulet, engraved with the symbols of the town's founders. It was the very relic Marjorie had spoken of. But as they reached for it, a cold gust of wind swept over them, and the spirit appeared. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes glowing with a vengeful fury. It was the man, the one who had been betrayed all those years ago. His face twisted in rage as he reached toward them, his cold fingers stretching across the air. But the group stood firm. They held the amulet high, the symbol of the past, the key to ending it all. And in that moment, the spirit let out a scream, a terrible wail that echoed across the cliffs. The ground shook beneath their feet as the spirit was pulled back into the earth, its form disintegrating into dust. When the dust settled, the town of Nightfall was quiet once more. The spirit was gone, and the curse had been lifted. The people of Nightfall knew that they owed their lives to Marjorie, the seer of Nightfall, the blind woman who had seen what no one else could. And they would never forget the lesson she had taught them. Sometimes the past comes back, not to haunt, but to demand its due. And in the end, it is only through facing that darkness and making peace with it that we can find peace ourselves. Story number 7. The House on Green Street. When the Jennings family moved into the old house on Green Street, they thought they had found their dream home. The house was large, sitting quietly at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac, its faded white paint hiding secrets within. It had a certain charm, with its creaky wooden floors and tall windows that let in the sun just perfectly in the mornings. The kind of place that made you feel like you could finally settle down. But there was one thing, the one rule, that everyone in the neighborhood knew about the house. It was whispered among the people who lived nearby, though no one said much directly to the Jennings family. The house had a basement, and the rule was simple: never enter the basement. Of course, for most of the neighbors that was enough. They'd seen strange things happen over the years. Lights flickering when no one was home, odd noises at night, a sense of unease that seemed to grow with each passing year. No one ever talked about it directly, but everyone knew. The basement was not to be touched. For the Jennings family, though, the rule was just a whisper of curiosity. The family, Peter, his wife Anne, and their 2 children, Sam and Lily, were eager to start fresh in their new home. Peter had just landed a new job, and Anne was excited about making the house feel like their own. Sam and Lily, though a little older, were just happy to have their own rooms and space to run around in. It wasn't long before the basement door caught their attention. It was tucked away behind a creaky old door at the far end of the hall, hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. No one ever spoke about it. It wasn't locked, but there was a sense of warning that hung around it, like a silent promise that some things were better left alone. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Sam and Lily were standing by the door, peering down the dark staircase that led into the basement. Their curiosity was too strong to ignore. Lily, the younger of the 2, tugged at Sam's sleeve. "Do you think it's safe?" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. Sam, always the brave one, grinned. "Who's going to stop us? The basement's just like any other room in the house. It's probably just old stuff." Lily hesitated, but then nodded. She followed Sam as he reached for the door handle. With a loud creak, the door swung open, revealing a long, dark stairwell leading down into an unknown shadow. The air down there was thick and cold, and a faint odor, musty and sour, rose up from the depths. "Let's go," Sam said, stepping forward without waiting for a response. Lily followed, more nervous now, but there was something in Sam's confidence that made her keep moving. The stairs groaned under their weight as they descended, the darkness growing deeper around them. At the bottom, they found a narrow hallway lit by a single dim light bulb that swung gently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The space was cramped, cluttered with old boxes, broken furniture, and faded pictures that seemed to stare back at them. "This place is creepy," Lily whispered, clutching Sam's sleeve. Sam didn't answer. He was already moving toward the far wall, where something caught his eye. A large, old mirror, cracked down the middle, with a thick layer of dust covering the frame. He wiped the dust away with his sleeve, revealing the reflection. But it wasn't just their faces that stared back at them. There were others. Faces that didn't belong. The figures in the mirror were distorted. Pale, blurry images of people who seemed trapped, their eyes wide with fear. Some were pressed against the glass, while others just stood in the background, waiting. The longer Sam stared, the more he felt something tugging at him, like they were calling him. He stepped forward. Lily gasped, pulling him back. "Sam, don't!" she cried, but it was too late. As soon as his hand touched the mirror, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The figures in the mirror started to move, their faces twisted with anguish, as if they had been trapped for centuries, waiting for someone to release them. Suddenly, the room around them seemed to open up. A rush of cold air hit them like a wave, and the mirror seemed to pull them in. The walls were no longer solid. The basement itself seemed to be alive, stretching and twisting, as though it were hungry for their fear. Sam and Lily screamed as they stumbled back, but the basement held them in its grip. The door they had come through slammed shut, locking them in. The figures in the mirror were no longer just reflections. They were real, and they were stepping out, emerging from the shadows. They were trapped. Upstairs, Peter and Anne heard the children's screams and rushed down to find them. But when they reached the basement, they found the door locked and the air colder than it had ever been. Peter tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself had decided to hold them in. From the other side of the door, they could hear Sam and Lily crying out for help, but their voices were growing faint. The air seemed to press in from all sides, thick with the sound of whispers. Low, mournful whispers that came from the walls themselves. The house was feeding off their fear. The basement wasn't just a room. It was a gateway. A place where the spirits of the trapped and the tortured had been waiting for centuries. And now, it had new souls to claim. As the family struggled to free the children, the house seemed to stretch and grow, its foundation alive with the power of the spirits that it had held captive for so long. No one could escape. No one had ever escaped. The basement was a trap, and the house on Green Street with its secrets buried deep beneath was always hungry. Story number 8. The Spirit of Hallows End. Every year, without fail, the town of Hallows End prepared for the same thing. Halloween night wasn't just a celebration of ghosts and ghouls, or of costumes and candy. No, it was something far more sinister. For on Halloween night, the spirit of a long-dead murderer returned. A restless soul doomed to walk the earth and claim one life. A life chosen at random, with no rhyme or reason. No one knew how or why, but each year, one person would die, and the town would be left with one more empty grave. It was a curse that had been passed down through the generations. No one talked about it openly, at least not in the daylight, but everyone knew. The old-timers would warn the children, their voices shaking as they spoke of the spirit, the murderer who had died long ago but whose bloodlust still haunted the town. And the young people would laugh it off, dismissing it as superstition. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Halloween was a night to be feared in Hallows End. Ethan Shaw wasn't from Hallows End. He had moved to the town only a few weeks ago, looking for a fresh start. He had taken a job at the local diner, met a few of the locals, and tried to settle in. But there was something about the place that bothered him. The air always felt heavy, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And the people, they were strange. They spoke in quiet voices, avoided certain places, and more than anything, avoided talking about Halloween. Ethan didn't know it at the time, but he had arrived at the worst possible moment. He first heard the story from old Mrs. Parker, the town's unofficial historian, as he was clearing the table after his shift. Her hands shook as she poured the coffee, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. "You're new here, aren't you, young man?" she asked in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, moved here about a month ago. I like it here, quiet." Mrs. Parker leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's quiet because of Halloween, son. You don't understand yet, but you will. On Halloween night, the spirit of the killer comes back. He returns to take someone, and it's always someone new. No one knows who it'll be, but you can feel it in the air. The town braces itself every year, but nobody's ever survived to tell the tale." Ethan chuckled nervously. "You mean like a ghost story?" Mrs. Parker's eyes didn't leave his face. "It's no story, it's real. Every year he takes someone. And this year, I think he's chosen you." Ethan laughed again, but it was less sure this time. He had heard stories like this before. Small towns and their superstitions. He figured Mrs. Parker was just one of those old women who liked to tell spooky tales. But something in her eyes made him uneasy. The next few days were a blur of normal life. Work, some quiet evenings, and getting to know the few neighbors who were willing to talk. But as Halloween drew closer, something started to feel wrong. The air turned colder, the streets grew emptier, and the people seemed more on edge. They kept their doors locked, their windows covered, and they moved through the town like they were part of a ritual they couldn't escape. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. At night, he would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and hear the faint sound of footsteps outside his window. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as Halloween night approached, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart racing, and the feeling of being followed would grip him like a cold hand on his chest. And then, on the night of October 31st, it happened. Ethan woke to the sound of a knock on his door. He had no idea who would be visiting him at this hour, especially on Halloween night, when the town was supposed to be locked up tight. He got out of bed, his feet cold against the wooden floor, and opened the door. There was no one there, just a single black feather on his doorstep. It was then that he understood. The spirit had marked him. Panic set in as he rushed to the window, his mind racing. He knew the history now, knew the curse. He had been chosen. And no matter where he ran, no matter what he did, the spirit would come for him. The town was holding its breath. They all knew what was coming, but they wouldn't warn him. They wouldn't lift a finger to help. He was on his own. Ethan grabbed his jacket and ran into the night, his heart pounding as the wind howled around him. The streets were empty, and the town was silent, as if it had all been waiting for this moment. He could feel the presence of something, someone, moving through the shadows, following him. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate. He didn't know how far he ran, but when he reached the edge of town, he stopped. His breath came in ragged gasps and he spun around, expecting to see nothing. But standing in the street behind him, just out of reach of the streetlight, was a figure. Ethan's blood ran cold as he stared at the figure. It was tall, shadowed, its face hidden beneath a dark hood, Its presence was suffocating, and he could feel it crawling under his skin, reaching inside him with cold, deathly fingers. But Ethan wasn't going to let it take him. Not like the others. He turned, desperate, and ran toward the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. He remembered the stories about the spirit's origins, how the killer had been buried there, how his spirit had never found peace. If he could make it to the cemetery, maybe, just maybe, he could stop the curse. As he reached the cemetery gates, the figure was right behind him, its footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Ethan threw open the gates, ran to the grave, and, with trembling hands, dug into the dirt. The earth was soft, yielding, as if the ground wanted to be disturbed. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for, an old rusted knife, the one that had belonged to the murderer in life. With the knife in hand, he stood up, facing the spirit that had been following him. "You want me?" Ethan yelled, his voice shaking. "Then take me, but not like the others. I'm not afraid of you." The spirit paused, and for the first time, Ethan saw its face. It was a twisted, rotting thing. Eyes empty, mouth curled into a grotesque grin. But Ethan didn't wait. He raised the knife and plunged it into the earth, stabbing the ground where the murderer's body had once rested. There was a terrible screech, and the spirit recoiled, its form disintegrating into smoke. And just like that, it was gone. Halloween came and went, and for the first time in centuries, the town of Hallows End awoke the morning after with no death, no curse, and no spirit returning from the grave. Ethan had stopped the killer. He had broken the curse. But deep down, he knew that some spirits never truly leave. Story number 9. The Girl in the Mirror. Sophie Matthews didn't believe in ghosts, not really. She had always dismissed the talk of spirits and shadows with a nervous laugh, shaking her head at the town's superstitions. But that was before Mia died. Mia had been her only child, a bright, curious girl with dark hair and wide, trusting eyes. The kind of child who would ask questions no one had answers to and laugh at things that weren't even funny. Mia had been everything to Sophie, her light, her joy, her reason to wake up every morning. But then the car accident happened. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. Mia had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sophie had heard the phone call, felt her world crack in half when the officer's voice came through the line, hollow and apologetic. She hadn't believed it at first. Even when she saw Mia's lifeless body in the hospital bed, it didn't seem real. She couldn't accept it. She couldn't accept that her daughter was gone. In the weeks that followed, Sophie tried to bury herself in the routine of her life, but the emptiness was always there, gnawing at her insides. Mia's room was still the same. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her toys were scattered across the floor as if she'd just left them behind for a moment. Sophie couldn't bring herself to pack it all away. It felt like if she did, she'd be giving up on Mia entirely. And then, one evening, it started. Sophie had just come out of the shower, the steam from the bathroom fogging up the large mirror in the hallway. As she wiped it away, she caught her reflection and something else. A small face, her daughter's face. For a brief moment, she swore she saw Mia standing behind her, looking at her with those wide, innocent eyes. Sophie froze. The reflection was gone in an instant, replaced by her own tired face staring back at her. But something had changed. Something wasn't right. She turned, expecting to find Mia there, standing in the hallway. But the house was empty, silent. At first, Sophie dismissed it as grief. It was natural, she thought, to see her daughter's face in the mirror. Grief plays tricks on your mind. But the next day, it happened again, and the day after that. Each time she looked into a mirror, whether it was the bathroom mirror, the one in the living room, or the glass of the kitchen door, she would see Mia's face. Sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, sometimes just staring back at her. Sophie tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her longing, her desperation to see her daughter again. But it felt real, too real. One evening, as she stood in front of the full-length mirror in Mia's room, she saw Mia again. This time, the reflection wasn't as fleeting. Her daughter's face lingered, staring back at Sophie, a sad smile on her lips. "Mia?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that really you?" But the smile faded, and the reflection of Mia's face twisted into something darker, something more sinister. The eyes that had once been full of life now appeared empty, hollow. The smile faded into a frown, and for the first time, Sophie felt something cold in the air around her. A presence. The next day, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She hadn't seen Mia's reflection again, but she felt it. Something watching her, waiting. She could hear whispers in the house, faint voices that seemed to come from nowhere. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind, the creaks of an old house settling. But deep down, she knew. By the time the next week rolled around, Sophie's obsession with the mirrors had only deepened. She found herself drawn to them, standing in front of each one for longer periods, trying to make sense of what was happening. The faces she saw weren't always Mia's, but they all had the same childlike features, the same hollow eyes. She couldn't stop. It was as if the mirrors were calling to her, pulling her in with their dark allure. She stopped going out, stopped answering the phone. The world outside the mirrors seemed distant, unimportant. All that mattered was the face that stared back at her from the glass. One night, she was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep when she saw it. The reflection of Mia didn't look like her daughter at all. The face in the mirror was twisted, deformed, its skin pale, stretched tight over sharp bones. The eyes that stared back at her were hollow, black pits, and the smile that stretched across its lips was cruel and mocking. Sophie staggered back, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't Mia. This wasn't her daughter. She had been so desperate, so lost in her grief, that she hadn't realized what was really happening. The spirit that had been trying to communicate with her was not Mia. It had taken Mia's form, using her face, her smile, to draw Sophie in, to feed off her sorrow and manipulate her. It had been toying with her, playing on her deepest fear, her strongest love. Sophie finally understood the truth. The mirrors weren't portals to her daughter's spirit. They were a trap, a gateway to something darker, something that fed on grief, on loss. It was a thing of shadows and lies, wearing the face of her child to lure her deeper into its grasp. But it wasn't too late. With the last of her strength, Sophie turned away from the mirror. She knew what she had to do. The thing in the mirror wasn't her daughter, and if she didn't break free from its hold now, she would be lost forever, just like the others before her. The mirrors cracked as she picked up the closest object she could find, a heavy book from the shelf, and hurled it into the glass. The reflection of Mia's twisted face shattered with a sharp, ringing sound, leaving nothing but the empty space in the frame. Sophie collapsed to the floor, her heart racing, her breath shallow. The mirrors were broken, and for the first time in weeks the house was silent. But as she looked around, something in her gut told her that the thing in the mirror, whatever it was, wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for the right moment, for the right weakness. It had taken Mia's face, her daughter's face, but it was not Mia. And Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it would return. The darkness had tasted her grief, and it would come back for more. Story number 10. The Death Watch. The invitation had come out of nowhere, an old yellowed letter addressed to the 6 of them, each name written in a looping script that was both familiar and distant. It had been years since they'd all been together. Life had scattered them, each one of them taking different paths. Some had moved far away, others had changed in ways that made their childhood bonds feel almost like a dream. But the letter pulled them back, like gravity. The words were simple, direct. Come together for a reunion. You won't regret it. It had been signed by none other than Tom Price, the man who had once been the glue that held the group together. Tom had always been the one to organize their late-night poker games, their wild road trips, and of course, their pranks. But now, Tom was dead. Or so they thought. The group was reluctant at first, but curiosity and nostalgia finally won out. They hadn't seen each other in over a decade. And after all, what could go wrong? The estate was located far out in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor or road. The mansion was ancient, crumbling in places, yet majestic in its own way. As they gathered in the expansive, dusty living room, sitting on worn-out armchairs and sipping whiskey, they exchanged old jokes and memories of their younger days. But there was something off. Something about the place felt wrong, like the air itself was thick with anticipation. That night, after a dinner of overly rich food and far too many drinks, they went to bed. But none of them would sleep easy. The first thing happened just before dawn. Jenna was the first to wake, her breath shallow and her skin cold. She sat up in her bed, eyes darting around the dark, unfamiliar room. The house creaked and groaned, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the corner of her vision. She turned her head slowly, her pulse quickening when she saw the figure. A man stood by the door. His features were indistinct, like someone blurred out of a photograph. But his presence was undeniable. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing that looked out of place in the old house. And his eyes, those eyes, cold, hollow, like the eyes of a dead man. Jenna's heart raced as she tried to speak, but no sound came from her lips. The figure pointed at her, and the air seemed to grow even colder. She felt a sudden pressure on her chest, like something was crushing her. Suddenly, the man vanished. She stumbled out of bed, gasping for air, but when she looked around, there was nothing. She rushed to the others' rooms, her footsteps loud and desperate against the old wooden floors. When she found the others, they were all still asleep, oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded just moments earlier. She didn't know what to say, how to explain what she had seen. But the next day, the atmosphere shifted. The group, already feeling uneasy, now found themselves on edge. They gathered in the parlor to discuss what had happened, but the air seemed to thicken with every word. No one wanted to say it aloud, but everyone could feel it. Something was coming. Something dark. Something angry. Later that evening, the first death occurred. Brian was found in the garden, his body twisted unnaturally. His face had been frozen in an expression of terror, his eyes wide open, staring at the sky. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of anything that could have caused his death. It was as if he had simply been taken. They tried to make sense of it, but nothing could explain it. The police couldn't be called, not without raising suspicions. They were deep in the woods, in a mansion far from civilization. And as the group huddled together, fear began to settle like a stone in their stomachs. One by one, they would all be questioned, haunted by their pasts. That's when Tom's name came up. As the night stretched on, the group grew more and more paranoid. Who would be next? Why had Brian been chosen? And why now? It wasn't long before they realized the chilling truth. It wasn't just random, it was deliberate. The spirit was punishing them. Each death was a warning, a reckoning. The second death came in the middle of the night. It was Claire, who had been closest to Tom. She had been his best friend, the one who had always been there when things got tough. But in the years before his death, there had been something between them, something unsaid, a distance that had formed when Claire chose to leave town and start a new life, leaving behind the group, leaving behind Tom. Now, she lay in the same spot Brian had been found, her body contorted, a look of horror frozen on her face. The room was cold, and the only sound was the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. They realized too late. The spirit was the Death Watch, the one who punishes those who have wronged the dead. And they had wronged Tom. Not directly, but by letting him slip through the cracks. They had ignored his calls for help. They had moved on with their lives, leaving him behind. And now it was time to pay. One by one, they were picked off. No one was safe. No one could escape. As the group dwindled, they realized they were not just being punished for their actions. They were being chosen. The Death Watch had claimed them, one at a time, picking them off as it deemed fit. In their final hours, with only two of them left, Jenna and Mark, they made one last desperate attempt to stop it. They tried to find the source of the spirit's wrath, to end the curse, but it was too late. The spirit was already inside them, inside their minds, tormenting them with memories of their betrayals. Jenna was the last to fall. Her body was found in the same garden where Brian had died, her eyes wide, filled with terror, frozen in the same deathly expression. Mark stood alone, his sanity cracking, knowing that he was the last one left. He hadn't been chosen yet, but he knew his time was coming. The Death Watch would claim him too eventually. It always did, and the house would stand, waiting for the next group of old friends to come together for a reunion. The reckoning would never stop. The Death Watch would always be there, waiting